This segment brought to you in part by Think Theo.
It has been 5 years since Missy Beavers, a Texas fitness instructor, was murdered just minutes before she was supposed to teach an exercise class in a Midlothian church. While there is video of a suspect at the scene, no killer has been caught. Missy's husband, Brandon Beavers, even came under suspicion. Joining us now to talk about this compelling case is Theo Acker. She is a pod and videocaster and had the chance to interview Brandon Beavers. Welcome to the show, Theo. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So before we dive into this case, which has so many moving parts and is so compelling, I just want viewers to get a little chance to know who you are, about your podcast, and what kind of issues do you cover in it?
Well, up until recently, my podcast was just that. It was all audio. But here in just the past 6 months, I decided that I needed to merge my podcast with the book that I was writing, which is called My Grief Is Not Like Yours. So I started doing a video cast, and I sent a message out to people that I could think of that were grieving and would want to talk about complicated grief. And I thought of Brandon Beavers. And I sent him a message on Facebook, and I got a response.
And when we talk about Brandon Beavers, he is the husband of Missy. And you said something very interesting about not all grief is the same, which I think is so important because we all grieve differently, especially someone whose wife was murdered. So take us to this interview. He is the husband of Missy. She was killed 5 years ago in this Texas church. I just want to take a listen to the podcast.
The purpose of the interviews, whether it was me or with my children, or anything media related, in my mind, was to speak to that person. That was the audience. It wasn't anything about anybody else. It wasn't about sensationalism. It wasn't about resolving the public curiosity or concerns. I don't give a about any of that. It was about speaking to that person. That person, hey, are you watching the son? That's who.
Wow, he meant business there.
Yes, you can sense Brandon's frustration and I think the reason that he responded to me is because I wanted to talk about his grief, the complicated part of it. Nobody has really asked, how are you, to Brandon Beavers?
Well, that's what I was just going to ask you. So you reached out to him for something completely different. You were working on this book, but yet he was top of mind. And what was his immediate reaction?
He said, his first words back to me, boy, oh boy, is this what I'm going through?
Wow.
When I reached out and said, would you like to talk about complicated grief? He just immediately responded because, like I said, nobody has asked Brandon how he is. They fixate on the actual murder.
Right. There's so many moving pieces to an event as, a murder, much less, one that's still a cold case. But I wonder, let's roll video of the person who police believe is the suspect in Missy's death, because it's although it's clear, you can't really get a sense of the gender. So here's this person milling around the church, and it looks like a SWAT uniform or some sort of police uniform, but no arrest has been made. What did Brandon have to say about this? Because it's clear as day, although you can't really see a face.
You would think, you've got a video, and you would think it would be easy. We can find, most people thought that this was going to be solved in about, 5 days, and now it's been 5 years. Brandon's extremely frustrated because until we can find who did this, he does not start his grieving process. His grieving process is delayed because there's no closure.
And on top of that, he was also named as a suspect at one point.
Initially, yes. They look at everybody, and they look at family members.
And when you interviewed him about this, what did he have to say about that?
He was okay. He wanted them to look at everyone. And in our interview, we discussed several things that went on during all of the investigation there in the early stages.
I wonder, since you are addressing this overarching theme of grief, how did you broach that subject with him, especially for a subject and something that's so public and covered by the media?
It was actually very easy with Brandon. He has experienced complicated grief, much like myself. And not a lot of people will experience that. I believe it's 4 to 5% of the population will ever experience a complicated grief. And what I mean by complicated is grief is an adaptive process, but the disruption in the adaptive process is complicated grief.
Right, of course. Like you mentioned at the top, we all grieve in different ways. I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing with us what you took away from this interview and what folks who listen and watch will take away from it.
Frustration and I know I keep repeating that word frustration, but that just sums it up the best. He wants to find out who did this so that he can have closure for himself, his 3 girls, Missy's mother, and the family, so that they can start the grieving process.
Right, and hopefully find some solace in there. There she is there. Too young.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Theo, for joining us. We
Thank
certainly
you.
appreciate all the stuff you're doing. And if you'd like to hear the entire interview with Brandon Beavers, head to Think Theo on Spotify or YouTube.